variables, what they are, why do we need them, and how do we make them. So the first thing we're going to do is right click here in the content browser, and we're going to go to Blueprint class, and we're going to just create an actor. And we're going to call this variables. So let's open this up, and we're going to go over here to the event graph, and I'm going to delete all of this stuff here because we don't need to worry about it. And we're just going to go over here to where it says variables and hit this little plus sign. And this is going to create our first variable for us. So we'll call this my variable. Now as you can see, it has a little red like bean next to it. If we go over here to the right hand side, we'll see it says variable type is a Boolean. Now if you click on this, you'll see that there's lots of different options that we can have for our variables, and even more underneath each one of these things, like structs, interface, object types, and so on. But we're going to talk about a few of these more important ones here in a little bit more detail. So we'll start with the Boolean just because it's the first one. Boolean variables are basically true or false. That's the only thing that they can be. So if you right click in here and look for a branch, this is the most basic thing that you'll be using a Boolean with, and as you can see, it only has an output of true or false. And if you look here, you'll see the condition is a little red pin. Unreal did a really nice job here with the blueprints of color coding these things, so it makes it very easy to see what kind of data types that you need to input into these functions. So you can tell right here, just because it's a red color, that it's going to need a Boolean variable to go in here. So we can click here and drop it here like this, and you'll see we now have a Boolean condition for this execution path. So we can attach something here and then have it decide based on our variable here whether we're going to do something off the true or we're going to do something off of the false. You guys can think of variables like data containers, okay? Just like the little blocks that we used to play with as kids. If you'd have a cube and you try and put it through the cube-shaped hole, same thing with the little pyramid, you have to put it through the pyramid-shaped hole, and the sphere goes through the sphere-shaped hole. It's the exact same thing with variables. These are just containers for data, and depending on the type of data that you want to save or store, you have to select the right variable. So a true or false, a yes or no, something like that, you're going to store as a Boolean variable right here. Now if you hit compile, you'll see we'll actually be able to change the setting of this variable. If it's unchecked, that means it's false. If you check it here, now it's a true. So you can set the default value for your variables over here in the right side panel. Alright, so that's a Boolean. Let's hit the plus sign again, and we'll create another variable. Call this variable 2. And we're going to change this one into a byte. And we'll hit compile and save. So now if we drag variable 2 out and say get, you'll see that this one comes up as a number here, 0. That's its default value. Now a byte can store any integer number, so no decimals, anything between 0 and 255. So if we try and type in 250, it'll save. You see it's okay with that. But if you type in -1, for example, you see it goes to 255 because you can't have a negative number as a byte. It's just not compatible. So if you need to store negative numbers, you'll need to find a different variable type. Bytes can go up to 255, and if you try and save 256, for example, you'll see it sets back to 0. So a byte can store anything from 0 to 255. Alright, let's create another variable here. Call it variable 3. And we will make this one an integer. Now an integer takes up a little bit more memory than a byte. That's why they're a little bit different. But the benefit that you get from having an integer here is that if you'll notice, if I type in -1, it holds. That's because integers can be negative numbers. And they can go past 255. As you'll see, I can put in 500, for example, and that will be okay. So integers and bytes are almost the same thing, except with an integer you get to have negative numbers and you get to have numbers greater than 255. I forget exactly where the max is for an integer, but yeah, so that's the difference between those two. You can add another variable here, we'll call it variable 4, and we're going to make this a float. Now let's drag this one out. And the nice thing about floats is now you see it says 0.0 because floats are allowed to have decimals. So you can type in 1.25 and it will stay. Floats can also be negative, so you can have a -5.5. These are really good for anything that you're going to do percents in, or a lot of times player health, things like that will be stored as floats because floats end up, when you use health bars or something like that, you're going to need decimals. So it's just easier to start them off as floats. You can also convert between integers and floats and bytes and integers, but sometimes it's just easier to start with a variable that you won't have to convert to or from. So that's a float. So we can add another variable here called variable 5, and we are going to skip name, we're going to go to string. So a string can basically be any character you can find on your keyboard. So they can be letters, A, S, D, F, G, H. They can be numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They can have little symbols like an exclamation mark. It doesn't really matter. Any kind of character that you can have or think of, you can put into a string. So we can drag that one out here. Let's do another variable. Variable 6, and we will make this a text. Now with texts are very similar to strings, except they take up a little bit more space and they are more easily localizable. So you can have, again, letters, numbers, whatever you want in here, and you can have that as a text. These are usually what you're going to want to store your data in if you're going to display it to the HUD. So if the player is actually going to see whatever's written, you'll probably want to use a text variable here instead of a string. Alright, let's make another one, variable 7. This will be a vector. So vectors, as you'll see, have X, Y, and Z components. So these actually have 3 things stored within them, and these are good for figuring out where something is located in the world on an XYZ axis, whether it's 2D or 3D. It's also good for magnitudes, directions, velocities, things like that. That will be stored as a vector. Let's add another variable, variable 8, and we'll get a rotator. We'll compile this and drag this one out here. And as you can see, this looks a lot like the vectors. The difference between these two are the types of functions that you'll be using them for. So the rotator is really XYZ for degrees, so many degrees rotation about these different axes, whereas this is more of a location in the world, XYZ axis. Alright, let's add another variable, variable 9, transform. We'll compile this. And as you'll see a transform, they even tell you right here. So use the same three axes, X, Y, and Z, but you have a location, a rotation, and a scale. So basically what a transform is, it's taking a vector variable, it's adding a rotation to it, and it's also giving you a scale. And scales are usually stored as vectors. So basically you get two vectors and one rotation that makes up a transform. And if you right click on any one of these variables, you'll see some that are made up of more than one. You'll have an option to split struct pin. So if you do that, you'll see exactly what they're made up of. So you see how these are yellow? Location and scale are yellow, and the middle one is purple, this light purple thing. That's telling you that it's made up of two vectors, because remember these are the same color, everything's color coded, and one rotator. So that's what makes up a transform. You can right click on it and recombine to get it back to this. We'll make one more variable, variable 10. And the other big one that we'll be using, especially in the beginning, is an object type variable. And we'll go down here to actor and over to object reference. Now, if we drag this out and compile, and we click on it, you see here it's asking for an object class. Because we haven't actually made this any particular actor, we can't set this right here. But normally you would make these objects, these object references, when you have like an overlap event or a player hits another player, something like that, and you want to be able to save whatever actor or object got hit, you will save it as an object reference like this. So for example, if I cast 2, and don't worry about what I'm doing right now in particular, I just want to be able to give you guys an example. So cast 2 player, let's see if they have, what is in here? Alright, player controller, for example. So you see right here, this is a blue pin. That means this is going to be an object reference. Player controller object reference. So if I right click here, I can actually promote it to variable, and this is like a little shortcut to creating variables. So now do you see how it's already popped up down here and created a new variable? So I can call this controller reference. And this basically stores a reference to the player controller. So this is a variable right here. Just like we have variable 10, I can drag this out and say get, and you see how it's a little blue object pin here. But this is a specific variable, so when I compile it, you'll see it's going to ask for a controller reference here. Whereas this one didn't ask, because it doesn't know what it is. This could be any actor right here. Now, if we hit variable again, as you can see, you guys can play around with these things. There's a lot more variable types that you can use, and obviously, depending on what you're making and what you're creating in your game, everything and anything can pretty much become a variable. So that was an overview of variables. I hope you guys thought that was helpful, and if you did, don't forget to like and subscribe and keep up to date on the latest tutorials. We'll be putting out some more tutorials for beginners just like this, kind of going over a lot of the basic stuff in Unreal Engine, and we hope it's helpful for you guys. Alright, see you later.